Excuse me, Your Worship, you're live whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. All right, Council, it's 5 p.m. and we are going to start our council meeting on this very snowy afternoon. And while we're doing this remotely, we do have some staff at Town Hall. So I have spoken to the clerk, and if we start running into road closures, we will look at where we are in the meeting and go from there. I also wanted to say that I've just received notice that the health unit is projecting temperatures will go down to -35 tonight, and the out of the cold shelter is operational. And at some point before the end of the meeting, maybe we can get that information so that we can give it to put it online, and as well mention it for our residents and for those who are watching. So I'm going to call the meeting to order, and I'm going to ask Councillor Jeffrey to please read the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. For more than 15,000 years, the First Nations walked upon and cared for the lands we now call home. Anishinaabek, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and many others who were families, friends, and communities the way we are today. The town of Collingwood acknowledges the Lake Simcoe-Nottawasaga Treaty of 1818 and the relationship it establishes with the original inhabitants of Turtle Island. We acknowledge the reality of our shared history and the current contributions of Indigenous people within our community. We seek to continue empowering expressions of pride amongst all of the diverse stakeholders in this area. We seek to do better and to continue to recognize, learn, and grow in friendship and community nation to nation.
Thank you, Councillor. And next we'll look for our motion to adopt the agenda. And just before we put the motion on the table, I do want to remind everyone that we are under our new civil procedure bylaw. So our procedural bylaw is in place. So that will include things like our time limits. And staff have advised me that they will be keeping track of the time limits. And Clerk Amos will hold up a card when the 5 minutes has expired. And we will move on to other council members, and then we will come back to that individual after that. So with that being said, the motion reads that the content of the Strategic Initiative Standing Committee agenda for January 10, 2022 be adopted as presented. Can I get a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Madigan and Councillor Berman. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Thank you. And that brings us to declarations of pecuniary interest. Any declarations tonight, Council? Seeing none, if you find yourself in that position as we progress, just let us know. And that brings us to item 4, which is the update on water capacity and land use planning study. And I will hand it over to CEO Skinner.
Thank you, Your Worship. Per normal, there is an updated deck that I will just run through quite quickly and point out some of the changes that have happened over the holidays and in the first week of January. Next slide, please. So, as you're aware, and I think the public's aware, there was a resolution from Council that you would receive each week when there's a meeting, updates on things like negotiations and RFPs, and we have included those in this update as required. Next slide, please. So the situation hasn't changed. We do, for anyone that's listening, have a water supply that's safe and available. Council's been exceptionally proactive as soon as they were aware of this difficult situation. Not only have you asked for updates every week, but it's been a proactive and transparent approach to look at ways to increase our capacity and manage the remainder. So we have used an interim control bylaw to temporarily and transparently pause development to ensure that the people of Collingwood have the water they need and we grow as a complete community. However, there's an exemption process, and all of the applications with ready-to-go development for 2021 has been approved by Council and continued, and there's an update on the end-of-year numbers that I find quite interesting a couple of slides ahead. And if you're looking at a residential renovation or addition, please talk to the building or planning departments. Most of those can also continue under the interim control bylaw. So we are closing in on the capacity to meet our expected growth over the next number of years till the end of 25 or early 26 when our new plant comes online, but we're not all the way there yet. And so we're working very hard to get there and to bridge our needs. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start, there's two parts to this update. The first is about the plant itself, and that's the water capacity update here. Next slide. So what's happened recently? Lots of good things. We have the design for the additional disinfection at the existing water treatment plant underway. You'll know that we had tendered for that, so now the design is happening. We have a pre-selection of the membrane treatment process for the new plant. The RFP closed in November, and Suez membranes has been selected. And this approach will allow us to design the plant for the exact right equipment, as opposed to asking the eventual constructor to make some changes as the plant is being built. So we believe this has been a good change, as we provided some more updates to council just before the holidays on this adjustment and approach that's potentially a little more intelligent for the COVID times and moving forward. As well, we updated you about the general contractors pre-qualification. So these contractors are considered able and of a size size-wise and skills-wise to construct our water treatment plant, including Canadian Contracting Limited, Maple Reinders Constructors Limited, North America Construction Limited, NAC. So these folks, and actually I'll just, at the end of the presentation, have Director Slama confirm. I thought there was 4, but there's 3 here, so maybe there was only 3 selected in the end. But they'll be on board with us throughout the design process, providing us with input on that the plant is very constructible and clear, and the documents are clear. That will help us ultimately in having accurate prices for the work, and work that can proceed expeditiously and without too many surprises. Our consultant's been on board for a while for the third-party review of the chlorine addition that we can do. How much water can we get through the plant with chlorine? And our approach for tracking services allocation. So we're anxiously awaiting that completion of that assignment. And those are the big changes on this slide for the plant perspective. Next slide, please. We introduced this new schedule with some of these early selections done up front, and it hasn't changed since December. So we're on track to complete the preliminary design in the spring of 2022. And I have had some conversations just before the holidays at the staff level with the CAO in New Tecumseh around the agreement. So I hope to be able to bring forward something to council in the near term so that we can get the agreement finalized with our partners in New Tecumseh. Next slide, please. The remaining water supply has been updated late last year. There were some additional final single dwelling units approved by council. If you'll recall, there were some apartments and the change of use, I believe, to a hair studio that have been incorporated. So the remaining allocation of water that's available is now 493 single dwelling units. If once we are able to complete the updates at the plant, we hope in 2023, that number will switch to the number in the bottom middle of the chart, which would mean we'd be able to go up to 1,283 remaining single development units until the plant is expanded. I think that's the main update on this slide today. Next slide, please. The second half of the presentation is really about the land use planning study and our progress on moving toward an allocation of water that would suit council and the community going forward. So the exemptions I mentioned, as council very well knows, we have an interim control bylaw in place, and exemptions have been approved by council. The exemptions are to get us through this land use planning study period. And afterwards, pending council approval, water would be allocated and managed according to the study recommendations. So if you have an exemption, you should continue through the planning and building permit process, and we'd encourage you to get in your application for a building permit expeditiously. And if you haven't been granted an exemption, planning applications are still being processed by on the staff side, and we'll bring those right up to the point at which a council planning decision would be required. And then we'll bring those forward to council per the process council's approved upon completion of the planning study and the interim control bylaw. Next slide. So we've made progress on the land use planning policy study. There was a meeting with council to present the recommendations on the 20th of December. And according to council's decision, we've moved things into 2 streams per your direction, per our recommendation and your endorsement of that direction. And we do have advertised the public meeting to present the zoning bylaw amendment. And there's some more details. We've added a little circle here that says see next slide, and there's more details on the next slide. So we will update this one overall summary as well as soon as we get opportunity, likely for next week. Next slide, please. So in 2022, per council's endorsement, we will have a second round. One of the paths is we'll have a second round of consultation on the draft servicing capacity allocation policy. So there was some excellent input from our development community and our consultants, as well as the community, and they asked to see things again. So those dates will to be determined, and we're working hard to make sure that there's lots of opportunity so that the community's values can be reflected in this proposed policy. And the second part of the path is the zoning amendment. To implement this, we have some minor changes to our zoning bylaw, which I mentioned briefly on the previous slide. So the next major step is a public meeting at council on January 24th. And there's more information on our Engage Collingwood page on the town's website. If anyone's looking for it, I much encourage folks to look at the material there. Unfortunately, I just wanted to bring it to everyone's attention. If the zoning bylaw is appealed, we would need to extend the interim control bylaw beyond April 22. So we're very much hoping that the zoning amendment will go through as proposed and will come to a successful conclusion on the servicing capacity allocation policy. Next slide, please. And as I foreshadowed, the building statistics for year end are in. Thank you to the building department and CBO Greg Miller. So the stats that are provided at the end after each semicolon are the 2021 stats. And just for comparison, we've also included in brackets the year-end 2020 stats. So I believe in, maybe not all cases, but in almost all cases, we're equal to or greater than the activity last year. So just a couple of highlights. We've received 1,150 building permit applications, which is roughly 100 more than we received last year. And we did issue 780 building permits compared to the 701 from last year. And you'll see as well in the final line of this slide, we had a construction value entered by those applying for permits of 168.7 million, which is substantially up from the numbers that were invested in the community last year. So notwithstanding that we wish we didn't have a water shortage, and we've done everything we believe to address it fairly and openly and transparently and quickly, I do believe that the ultimately the jobs in the community and the construction, on target to meet the community's needs has been continued through this past year and is a good news story for Collingwood in general. Or maybe a silver lining, if not a good news story, to the difficulty of that we've addressed in the water side. Next slide, please. This is an updated slide, and we actually have a couple of other stats we'd like to add in the coming week or two. So what I have here is the on the left side, the percent of the total building permits with exemptions by building permit status. So we're actually narrowing in on, we've got 68% of the total building permits that were included in our 45 projects have been issued. And there's about a 28% under review. And then there's only 4% of the total building permits that we're still expecting to receive. So I think that's good news. And I find these numbers a little confusing, even myself, but I have gone over them in quite some detail. The reason that they can get confusing is that little caveat up at the top that we have 45 projects that have received exemptions from council. But some of the projects have multiple building permits. So there's some, for example, for a development where you might have 80 plus building permits in a single project. So that sort of skews the numbers when you look by project or by permit. That doesn't skew the numbers, it just changes the math so that but the actual numbers are getting up there, which is good news. And the percent of exempted projects by building permit status is on the right side. So we have 40% of the projects that we haven't received applications for, but a number of those are singles or not a lot of houses or things happening in those applications that haven't come forward yet. The other information that we would like to provide to council is a percent of the water that was in the exemptions that's gone out for within building permits. And there was also a question, I believe, from Councillor McLeod, if I recall correctly, around the number of dwelling units that are actually being built. And I think that we are yet to bring that forward as well, but we have it in mind. And I believe that may be the last slide. So thank you for all that time, Chair. And if there are any questions, the team and I would be happy to address them.
Thank you very much, CAO. Council, are there any questions or comments on the presentation? Seeing none, thank you very much for that. And it's good to get the year-end numbers, and it does tell a different story than certainly the 27 deputations we heard on August 20 or April 26. So thank you for that. Before we move on to our consent agenda, I am just going to give the information for the out of cold contact info. And the website is outofthecoldcollingwood, all one word, .com/. The phone number is 705-828-3477. And you can also contact them through Get Connected, all one word, at busbycenter.ca. And we'll read that again before the end of the meeting as well. And that brings us then to item 5, which is the consent agenda. And first, I'm just going to put the motion on the table to get the agenda received, and then I will ask for items to be pulled. And so the motion reads that council herein receive the general consent agenda, and further that the information and opinions provided in the general consent agenda items are those of the authors and are not verified or approved as being correct. We have 3 items tonight. 5.1, Bakertilly Interim Audit of December 31, 2021 financial statements. 5.2, Collingwood General and Marine Hospital, state of hospital and preparations for Omicron. And 5.3, AMO calls to action, joint and several liability. And so I will look for a motion to get these items received. Moved by Councillor Jeffrey, seconded by Councillor Madigan. So I'll call the vote. All in favor? And that is approved unanimously. And there are any items to be pulled tonight, Council? Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, Worship. Item 5.3, please.
All right. Are there any other items, Council? Seeing none, go ahead, Councillor Doherty.
Thank you. Just by way of explanation, in particular for the public, joint and several liability challenges municipalities to assume someone else's responsibility for someone else's mistakes, making municipalities, in effect, the insurer of last resort. This obviously has the effect of driving costs of insurance for municipalities. And just taking town of Collingwood as an example, our costs of insurance have increased 50% over the past 5 years. And then in addition to the financial risk, joint and several liability also has implications relative to management of risk. So for example, increased use of road salt, which has negative impacts on wetlands and waterways. And to some degree, it also limits the creativity and the range of services that a municipality can offer in an effort to limit liability. So in 2018, AMO requested the Premier to review joint and several liability and to come back with an alternative option to the legislation that we have in place in the province of Ontario. And to date, there has not been a report received. So the motion that AMO is asking of the province and asking for municipalities who are members to support is to urge the province to come forward with a new structure for joint and several liability before the end of its own term. And I have a motion drafted. Oh, and when my screen just shut down. Clerk Almus, could you read the motion, please?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Sure. Thank you, Your Worship. Certainly, Councillor Doherty. The Council supports AMO's call upon the province to re-establish the priority for legislative action on joint and several liability before the end of its mandate, and to support AMO's previously submitted recommendations for joint and several liability reform. And again, this would be a notice of motion this evening.
Thank you very much, Councillor Doherty. And so that will then be addressed at our next regular meeting of council.
Terrific, thank you.
All right, unless there's any other questions or comments on item 5.3, we're going to move on then to item 6, which is staff reports. And the first staff report we have tonight is item 6.1, CCS 2022-1, COVID-19 considerations to align with moving to modified step 2 of the roadmap to reopen. And I will look, I think, to Executive Director Peg to walk us through this report. Go ahead, Executive Director.
Hi, good evening, Your Worship. Members of Council, I do have a presentation. Excellent, thank you. All right, so tonight I will be providing an overview of the COVID-19 considerations and the actions taken to align our organization with moving to modified step 2 of the provincial roadmap to reopening. And although I will be providing this update, I would like to acknowledge and recognize that our collective response to COVID-19 and the recent changes has been a significant team effort. And staff at all levels of the organization have played a role in meeting these new requirements. Next slide, please. So as we are all aware, there has been a rapid increase in COVID-19 infections taking place globally due to the highly transmissible Omicron variant. In response, the province returned to the modified version of step 2 to the roadmap to reopen effective Wednesday, January 5th, and for at least 21 days. And this is subject to trends in public health and health system indicators. Measures introduced are listed in the report, but to highlight a few, reducing social gathering limits to 5 people indoors, 10 outdoors, limiting capacity at organized public events to 5 indoors, requiring businesses to enable remote work where possible, closing indoor meeting and event spaces with limited exceptions, but permitting outdoor spaces to remain open with restrictions, public libraries limited to 50% capacity, and closing indoor sport and rec facilities, and closing public and private schools. Next slide, please. The Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit stresses that now is the time to keep your social circle small and avoid the 3 C's. So closed spaces, crowded places, and close contacts. Our local medical officer of health, Dr. Gardner's letter of instruction also continues to be in place. All levels of government stress that following public health measures is more important than ever to limit the spread of COVID-19 in Ontario. And this includes the importance of all eligible Ontarians becoming fully vaccinated and obtaining boosters. Next slide, please. The town continues to respond in a nimble manner to new and evolving regulations and guidance. Administration and council continue to act in a responsible way in ensuring the safety of staff and our community. And this includes continued adherence to robust COVID-19 policies, procedures, and protocols. These were introduced at the start of the pandemic, but have been updated and amended throughout as required. Department heads also continue to actively review contingency plans, and each essential service, so our fire service, water and wastewater, have robust plans in place to aid in mitigating potential impacts, including the identification of redeployment options and plans. However, I do feel that it's worth noting that not all services can be delivered through internal redeployments. So I, for example, cannot be a firefighter tomorrow. It is therefore critical that all precautions be taken to protect our essential services and staff. Next slide, please. Administration and council acted quickly to implement the required recommended changes in response to provincial direction. And this includes, but certainly not limited to, the items identified in the report. So closing services or establishments that were identified in the Ontario regulation, pausing in-person services at the building and planning front counter, reviewing the town hall customer service hours, and continuing all staff to work remotely when able to do so. The library will continue to operate at 50% capacity. Critical services, of course, like fire, water, and wastewater will continue to be delivered. Council meetings will be held virtually during the modified Step 2 period, and we've made adjustments to our flag raising protocols. Next slide, please. On December 13th, the town hall customer service counter opened to pre-COVID hours. So that was Monday to Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. As part of our response effort, administrative latitude to set the customer service hours at town hall is being sought, in part to align with the spirit and intent of the provincial and local requirements and guidance, but mainly to mitigate potential exposure to staff, ensure ability to create capacity to support contingency plans, and to ensure administration can act quickly as required in the event a redeployment is necessary. In a quick review of local municipalities, Collingwood and Wasaga Beach remain open with full in-person services at this time, while the others have closed or moved to appointment only. Our intention will continue to be providing excellent, accessible customer service while ensuring staff and public safety, while promoting online services, and the consideration of reverting to hours offered during the previous stage 2 will be discussed at department heads, pending latitude to do so. Next slide, please. The town's response also included the implementation of a mandatory vaccination policy. This policy is now in full effect as of January 1st, and the unpaid leaves of absence have been enacted. Departments have been actively redeploying staff or seeking short-term contracts to cover any vacancies that have resulted from the policy. And staff are closely monitoring the booster shot availability and provincial rollouts of vaccines to ensure continued compliance with the policy, and that our definition of fully vaccinated remains aligned with that of the province. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the town is not immune to the real and potential staffing impacts that may result from several factors that are currently impacting both private and public sector organizations. This includes the amended guidance on isolation periods and the lack of COVID-19 testing. End of day reporting from today actually differs from this slide, but we have approximately 17 staff in isolation or recovery as a confirmed or assumed positive case, an additional 11 staff that have been identified as close contacts. Luckily, remote work options have mitigated some of this impact. We have also identified potential impacts to contracted services, and this is being monitored closely as service providers too are grappling with staffing impacts due to confirmed and assumed cases and lack of testing options. Our mandatory vaccination policy, we have less than 10 staff placed on unpaid leaves of absence. Staff are cognizant that our ability to maintain service levels with minor delays may be impacted if we see higher confirmed or assumed cases in our staff complement or within contracted services. Next slide, please. Moving forward, staff are of course committed to keeping council apprised of any impacts to services or programs that result from capacity issues. And we continue to act in a responsible manner in ensuring the safety of staff and community. We will continue to adhere to our robust policies, procedures, and protocols and leading by example. And we will continue to follow public health measures and the provincial requirements. And I believe that was the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. I'm going to, this is a committee meeting, so I'm going to turn to Clerk Almas to see if we have anyone in our audience who would like to speak to that report.
Thank you, Your Worship. Again, attendees to this meeting are permitted to speak to up to 5 minutes regarding the specific report. If you wish to speak to the Standing Committee this evening, please press the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will unmute you. And there is no interest at this time, Your Worship.
Right. Thank you, Clerk. So I will read in the resolution, and it reads as follows. Staff report CCS 2022-1 COVID-19 considerations to align with moving to modified step 2 of the roadmap to reopen be received. The Council reconsider resolution 324-2021 specific to the reinstatement of town hall customer service, semicolon, and round bracket requires a 2/3 majority vote, end bracket, and that the Chief Administrative Officer or designate have the authority to amend town hall in-person customer service hours based on provincial and local guidelines and or the capacity of staff to deliver the in-person service. Can I get a mover and a seconder for that, please? Councillor Hamlin and Councillor Doherty. And before I open it to questions from the floor, I'm just going to turn to Clerk Almas just to explain why we need the 2/3 majority. There is new information, which in the past didn't require, I think, the 2/3 majority, but in this case, we have changed our procedural bylaw. So go ahead, Sarah, please.
Correct. Thank you, Your Worship. New information does provide Council the ability to continue to make reconsideration on previous decisions that occur within 12 months. However, it doesn't limit or change the requirement of having 2/3 majority vote to reconsider the matter.
Okay, thank you for that. Council, questions or comments? Councillor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. So to understand the way that it's put together here through to the clerk, we would have to vote on receiving the report separately. We'd automatically have to sever out. Or do we just have to have a majority saying we want to reconsider? I'm not understanding.
Clerk Almas, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. To Councillor Jeffrey's question, correct. The report would be received, and then the remaining 2 items would be severed out and voted each separately as well. So it'd be 3 resolutions from this matter, or potentially 2 if Council does not wish to reconsider.
All right. Then I guess by way of questions, I think that we have done an excellent job of protecting our staff at Town Hall and the changes with the plexiglass and the requirements for the vaccinations. And I saw that CAO Skinner put out a memo regarding triple filters in the masks. And I still feel that there were a lot of cases in terms of the services we provide as a municipality that require more timely response than we were able to give having so many work remotely. And one of them that comes to mind is funeral homes and our ability to make sure they have the paperwork to facilitate in a timely manner what they're doing. So that's just one example, probably of many. I think as far as everything else goes, us still meeting virtually, fine, that's great. But I think that we do need to be able to provide, whether it's a basic staffing at customer service where someone can get a real person and get referrals and information they need for what they're doing. So, and that's the only part that is bothering me. So I'll wait and see what other people have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And just, I'll take from your comments, Councillor Jeffrey, you'd like to have all three severed out individually?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Councillor, any other questions or comments? Councillor Hamlin.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to our Executive Director. If a resident shows up at Town Hall and can't open the door but has a burning question along the lines that Councillor Jeffrey has mentioned, is there any instructions for such a resident to know what to do next?
Executive Director.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you to Councillor Hamlin. So there is signage on Town Hall. I will also note as well that if a resident does come up to the door and our customer service staff happen to see them and they're, in desperate need and they're in the office, there have been times where they have opened the door to assist someone with a burning need. I'll also note that it is not our intention, unless required to do so by law, to shut customer service fully. So although some local municipalities have opted to close their doors Monday to Friday, that would not be our intention. Moving to less hours would allow us to stagger shifts with the customer service staff for less in-person time for that small unit. But our intention wouldn't be to close the doors fully.
Thank you. Follow-up, Councillor?
Yes, I have one follow-up question. Oh, sorry, I think the CIO would like to comment on that first.
CIO Skinner.
Thank you, through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Hamlin, and also somewhat to Councillor Jeffrey, based on her question. It would also not be our intention to close the counter unless we really needed to do so. So I think we have some pressing needs in the short term, but we would be looking to maximize the hours and maximize the time open that we can do. We were just seeing, and I'm happy if Executive Director Peg wants to clarify some of this because I was away until today. However, but what we would like to do is between meetings be able to react quickly to the needs of the staff to accommodate the current Omicron virus and what happens during those periods. Thank you.
Thank you. Follow-up, Councillor Hamlin.
No, I'll just comment briefly, Mr. Mayor, that it sounds I have full confidence in our senior staff to manage our front desk, and I like the plans that I hear. So I'll vote in favor of this. Thank you.
Thomas.
Certainly, sorry. Thank you, Your Worship. I also wanted to respond to Councillor Jeffrey's concern regarding the funeral homes. So throughout COVID, the province, I am the division registrar for vital statistics for the town of Collingwood, and we have deputy division registrars amongst three of my staff within our department. But the province allowed funeral homes to actually be sub-registrars and be able to complete some of their own documentation. They've also experienced staffing shortages or inability to attend, and we've actually been attending in person to funeral homes, and I would like to check on that, but I feel that our service has been enhanced since COVID regarding the funeral and death registration components of it. But I'm glad to further look into that as well.
Thank you. Councillor, any other questions or comments on this? Councillor Berman.
Mayor Saunderson, through you to staff, just as a clarification, I guess it seems to me, why are we reconsidering the entire thing when It seems that the intent is just to deal with the front desk. That's what I'm concerned about. Is were we considering an entire motion just for this one thing? Or can that not be severed out? Or
I'll look to who wants to take that. Is some of the stuff in the initial motion? I think there was discretion to do stuff. So there's one aspect. So Clerk Almus, go ahead.
Thank you. And that was a good question for clarification to through your worship to Councillor Berman. So this would only reconsider it if you're allowing this component to be reconsidered, that would be put next on the floor. So all of the remaining items that were part of that original motion would stay intact unless someone wished to further make a change to another component of that original recommendation that was made on October 25th.
Follow-up, Councillor.
Okay, so if council votes for the reconsideration, even though it says specific to the reinstatement, that's the only thing we're reconsidering. Okay, thank you. So then also through the mayor to staff, what if the pre-COVID hours are the concern? Is there a mindset as to what you might want if this were to be reconsidered and approved?
Executive Director.
Thank you, Worship, through to Councillor Berman. I will echo the comments of CEO Skinner. It is our intention to have the front counter open as much as possible, but still be mindful of having the capacity to have staggered shifts with the customer service staff. So when we're open a full day, for example, we need to have at least 2 employees present to cover lunch and just for the flow of the workflow, and also to not have an employee at the front counter alone throughout the day. That said, we would have department heads tomorrow and discuss what made the most sense. But building on what CEO Skinner had said, we also want to make sure that we have the ability to act quickly. So in the event we did require the redeployment of customer service staff, as things currently sit, we would be coming back to council potentially, a special meeting would need to be called or be 1 or 2 weeks later to ask for the latitude to do that. By having this latitude, we'd be able to redeploy those staff and then the hours in order to offer staggered shifts, et cetera. The exact hours would be determined based on discussions with department heads, but would be no less than what council has seen in past.
Follow-up, Councillor Berman. Okay. Any other questions or comments, Council? Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, Worship. I admit I really struggled with this particular staff report and recommendation. But at the end of the day, I think that, the circumstances all along for the last 2 years have required us to be flexible and to be able to, and I hate this word, pivot. And this is all part of that, really. And I guess the other thing that makes me want to support this staff recommendation is that the municipality should be seen as taking a leadership role here, and this recommendation would be part of that. So I will support all 3 elements of this recommendation.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments, Council, before I call the votes? Seeing none, dealing with the first branch, the staff report CCS 2022-1, COVID-19 considerations to align with the moving to modified step 2 of the roadmap to reopen be received. All in favor? That is passed unanimously. Dealing then with the second branch, which is that Council reconsider Resolution 324-2021 specific to the reinstatement of Town Hall customer service, and a 2/3 majority is required. All in favor? And opposed? And so that is defeated. And so with that, we have I think I'm going to look to the clerk, but there's no need then to address the third branch. All right. And that brings us then to item 6.2, P 2022-1, Ontario Land Tribunal OLT appeals process. And just before I pass it over to Director Valentine, this report is dealing with the appeals process, and we will be dealing with questions about specific appeals under item 7.1. So the first aspect of this is just dealing with the appeals process and what's in the staff report. And so with that being said, I'll pass it over to Director Valentine.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good evening to members of council, staff, and those from the public joining us. Similar to the mayor's opening comments, I would also like to provide some initial thoughts on summarizing why this report was able to be dealt with and presented in open session, when typically this council is familiar with matters before the Ontario Land Tribunal being discussed in camera, which would allow the provision of legal advice. So the purpose of this particular report is to consider a formalized process regarding how appeals to the Ontario Land Tribunal are dealt with when they are received by the town. And in order to provide more clarity and certainty to this council, the development community, and the public. So while appeals that are currently underway are listed in the staff report and general information is provided, such as the file number, the address, and the status of the appeal, it's not the intent to discuss the details of site-specific appeals under active litigation, which are more appropriately deliberated through a closed session. So therefore, our conversation today is intended to be focused on the processes or the general nature of the ongoing appeals, with the understanding that individual reports or updates for each appeal will be brought forward separately in camera for council's consideration. So for those who are not familiar with the term Ontario Land Tribunal, or OLT for short, most applications under the Planning Act, and that means development applications, policy changes, and other land use matters, include the right to file an appeal to the OLT, either of a decision made by the approval authority, in this case council, or a lack of decision being made within a specified legislative timeframe. So when an application is appealed to the tribunal, the entire process is taken out of the hands of locally elected officials and placed in the hands of a provincially appointed tribunal. And most of the time that tribunal is represented by a single presiding member. The OLT also addresses appeals under the Ontario Heritage Act, and that includes heritage permits. So in the past, the town averaged 2 major appeals to the OLT annually, and that lower volume allowed for more time to work through matters, to inform council, to receive direction ad hoc as needed. But with the number of appeals increasing, now 7 in progress, as you will have seen from the report, staff are feeling a need to provide for a more formalized process. And a consistent and predictable process with defined roles and responsibilities, which will ensure that this council is made aware of OLT appeals to major planning applications or heritage permits as they're launched, and that council is afforded the opportunity to provide direction to staff and the town solicitor. So as outlined in the report before you, the general process being recommended includes 6 stages, and that begins with notifying council in a publicly open forum that an appeal has been received. And this would be followed by an initial staff report, which would be considered in closed session, and that staff report would be intended to provide council with a baseline knowledge that they would need to provide initial direction to staff regarding how the appeal should be dealt with. The report, as envisioned, would outline the nature of the appeal, provide background information, include a staff opinion, or what additional materials would be needed in order for staff to formulate an opinion. It would include an estimate of cost, amongst other matters that are listed in the report. So at this stage, council would receive legal advice, as well as determine if additional public involvement is desirable. And while the OLT does provide opportunity for the public to become what's called parties or participants to an appeal, that process can be challenging for individuals to understand, and as well as costly for them to participate in. So in some cases, council may wish to facilitate public engagement outside of the OLT process, but a note of caution around that. And the reason that our staff report is recommending that these be looked at on a case-by-case basis is that the decision does still rest with the Ontario Land Tribunal. So once council has been provided with that initial in-camera report, they will provide staff and the town solicitor with direction on the appeal, which we would implement. And we would provide periodic updates so that council could adjust their direction or position on the matter. If part of that direction does involve a possible settlement to the appeal, which can be desirable to reduce costs and increase certainty around outcomes, any recommended settlement must be endorsed by council, and every effort would be made to attempt to reach a settlement that's agreeable to all parties. So I think it's worth mentioning that settlements can be unsettling actually to the public, as they can be perceived as secretive, closed door type discussions. However, in addition to cost savings of going the route of a settlement rather than a full appeal, and there was some cost estimates included in the staff report before you, there can be significant additional benefits to a settlement. There is a very limited ability to revisit Ontario Land Tribunal decisions. And as mentioned, they're often in the hands of a single unelected individual who may have limited familiarity with our local context. So going down the road of a settlement would typically allow for a baseline certainty that the town interest can be appropriately addressed. So in the case of a settlement, if one were to be proposed in association with an appeal, it would be clear to council or made clear to council which parties, if any, objected to the proposed settlement. And ultimately, as mentioned, the OLT would decide if the settlement represents good planning. And those parties that object to the settlement can make their arguments in front of the tribunal. So the last stage of the process is final reporting on an appeal, and that type of reporting would summarize any decisions or orders coming from the tribunal, along with activities and next steps to be undertaken by the town in order to implement the tribunal's outcome. And the reporting might also include recommendations for policy changes or regulatory updates that were brought to light during the appeal in order to enhance the protection of the public interest or advance the community's vision overall for land use in Collingwood. So while the recommended process in front of you would not at this time require any amendments to the town's procedural bylaw in order to implement, we also included a paragraph at the end with some forward-looking suggestions that would augment the process potentially in the future. Should this process be endorsed, staff would endeavor to bring forward reports on appeal matters that are imminent with respect to critical next steps in the next couple of months at the OLT for council to consider in camera and to provide direction to staff with a target of later this month. That concludes my remarks on the report, Mr. Chair, and happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, Director Valentine. And I'm going to turn to Clerk Thomas to see if there's anyone in our gallery that would like to speak to this report.
Certainly, thank you, Your Worship. Again, if you wish to speak to the staff report, please press the raise your hand feature. And at this point, we have Mr. Don May would like to address the standing committee.
All right. Mr. May, we can see you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I read the report with interest, and I'm not speaking to any specific matter in my discussion. It is discouraging that the cost and effort of the OLT process could be used to bypass good planning. The report provides an excellent overview of the process and the implications involved. The report plainly and understandably describes the issues of complexity, time, expense, and confidentiality, given it is a matter of litigation. This is an excellent report, and I support the recommendation. The report clearly states that council must decide the appropriate process for each matter referred to the OLT. Respectfully, I would like council to consider the following guideline in determining the appropriate process. And the guideline is, where a staff report has not been completed and where time allows, council should direct that the staff report be prepared and there be an opportunity for the public to make comment before council takes a position on the matter prior to the hearing. In conclusion, if the public does not have the benefit of knowing the staff and council position, how does an individual decide to involve themselves in a very complex and onerous process? A transparent process and public input are essential to good planning in Ontario. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. May. Sarah, is there anyone else in our gallery that would like to speak to this report?
Not at this time, Your Worship.
All right, thank you. So I'll read in the resolution. The staff report P 2021 or 2022-1 Ontario Land Tribunal OLT appeals process be received, and that the general process outlined in report P 2022-1 be followed when new major OLT appeals are received related to applications under the Planning Act and Ontario Heritage Act for which the town is the approval authority. And further, that staff continue to monitor the resources allocated to OLT matters and report back to council on budget and workload implications, including the ability of staff to deliver on legislative development review and approval functions and priority projects identified in the town's approved community-based strategic plan and budget plan. And I get a mover and a seconder for that, please. Councillor Jeffrey and Councillor Hamlin. Questions or comments, council? Councillor Hamlin, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a comment, and that is to thank Director Valentine, her team and senior staff for this report. I feel that we have taken so many steps for transparency during our term, and this is maybe one of the last holes that we needed to be filled. I am very encouraged to see that when appeals are filed, council will be told in a public session, so our community will also know. I have found it somewhat, unsettling to have residents ask me about particular appeals, and when I didn't even know they were under appeal. But of course, they get notice because they're in the circulation district for particular notices of hearing. Meanwhile, council has no clue what's going on. So this and all the details in that report, I am just so thankful. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, any questions or comments? Councillor McLeod.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. Yeah, I have a couple of questions about that, and I echo Councillor Hamlin's comments about gratitude for this report and the thoroughness thereof. I'm curious to know how it is that, and I don't want to refer to a particular case, but I'm wondering how it is that we are here. Did something change? Did the OLT's timelines change? Did something happen that triggered this other than we have a new director of planning?
I think you're referring to some of the non-decision timelines.
Yeah, I'm asking about that too, but also, I mean, this council has been sitting for 3 years, and I have found myself in the very uncomfortable position described by Councillor Hamlin, wherein a person would say to me, well, you know that this particular development is under appeal at the OLT, and I did not know, and none of council, well, maybe some did, but I certainly didn't. And I'm curious to, is that how we ended up with this report, or do we have this report because Director Valentine has arrived and saw a need? I'm just curious to know how we got here.
Director Valentine, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to Councillor McLeod. Certainly volume was the main driver in that, as I mentioned in my remarks, that when you have 1 or 2 appeals annually, a robust process on reporting through to council is not necessarily required, given that you'd have more time and council will be quite familiar, and one or two appeals are easy to track. Having 5, 6, 7 plus in a year, it starts to get more complicated for staff and council to continue to track what can be multi-year processes at the OLT. So certainly the volume and staff, council, members of the public and the development community have all, if in different ways, asked for clarity and more certainty around what the process is. So we wanted to provide some transparency, visibility, and sightline through to that process and give ourselves collectively a way to deal with what will only be an increasing volume of appeals at the OLT. And the staff report does go through some of the reasons that we believe the volume may be increasing.
Thank you. Councillor MacLeod, follow up?
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, were there changes in the timelines put together by the OLT or whatever the timelines that are required? Is that why one of the reasons? I just want to have that said publicly one way or the other.
Director Valentine.
Through your worship, yes, certainly in the past couple of years, the Planning Act timeframes have been reduced, and that was in order ostentatiously to get housing to market more quickly, but that has had an effect on the number of appeals as well.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments, council? Seeing Councillor Doherty, go ahead.
Thank you. And through you to Director Valentine, I also will echo the thanks for the same reason for having brought this staff report forward. But I also want to thank Mr. May for the comments that he has made, because indeed we are facing, not only in this municipality, but throughout Ontario, with a planning framework that runs the risk of superseding good planning principles. And I think it's very important for me anyway, to be very cognizant as we review all of these appeals, that we should not be pressured or frankly bullied into approving what is otherwise best and highest practice for planning in this community. But certainly I will support the recommendations of this staff report, but I do keep in mind that caveat and share it with my colleagues and with staff.
Thank you, Councillor Doherty. Other questions or comments, council? Before I call the vote, I just like to say I do echo those sentiments, but I also, this is an aspect, I think, of risk management, which we've had a number of discussions around the council table about, and this way of quantifying, setting out a process, the ways that we can assess OLT appeals, costs, and the merits moving forward in a way that allows as much public consultation in that process moving forward. It's going to be, it certainly appears, it's going to be an increasing burden for this council and for our staff. And I just had one question for Director Valentine. It sounds to me like we're looking at doing a 6-month review of this policy so that we can gauge how it's working and what needs to be tweaked as we move forward on this.
Yes, Your Worship, that would be correct in terms of how it's laid out in the report. This would be quite a bit of reporting in the short term to get us up to speed with the 7 appeals that are underway. But staff have recommended some future forward enhancements, which this council may wish to consider once this process is up and running. We've had an opportunity to evaluate any challenges and benefits associated with it.
Great, thank you for that. And I would imagine that would also involve any comments from the public about ways to make the process more open and transparent for our residents, as well as we move forward through these important procedures. And with that being said, then I will call the vote. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. And that brings us then to departmental updates. And item 7.1 is current OLT appeal updates. And I will pass it back again to Director Valentine.
Thank you, Your Worship. And this departmental update does actually follow the direction of the previous staff report that was just considered by committee. And that is to ensure that when new appeals to the OLT are received, they are appropriately and clearly highlighted to council and members of the public in an open forum. And so while all 7 appeals were listed in the staff report just presented, we did want to take the opportunity to clearly indicate that 2 of those are new. They were received before or during the 2021 holiday break. And staff are in the process of compiling the records for those 2 appeals to forward them to the OLT. So the first was received on December 23rd, and it's related to a site plan application for the Collingwood Harbour House development, which is located at 31 Huron Street. And the appeal in that case is for a non-decision, meaning that a decision on the site plan application was not made within the legislative timeframe required by the Planning Act. And this appeal is somewhat more complex in that there was already an appeal of a non-decision to the related zoning bylaw amendment, which is required to facilitate that same development. It is quite a strong possibility that both of these matters would be consolidated at the OLT once they receive the record and would be combined into one appeal process essentially. The second one that we wish to highlight this evening was received on December 29th, and it's related to council's partial refusal of a heritage permit for the painting of the masonry at 12 4th Street. Staff are currently preparing in-camera reports for both of these matters. And are looking to present them to this council later this month with input from the town solicitors. The town solicitors are at this time corresponding with the representatives for each appeal to ensure that communication lines remain open until council is prepared to provide staff direction on these matters. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Director Valentine. Council, any questions or comments? Seeing none, then Councillor McLeod, go ahead.
Sorry about that, slippery fingers. Through you, Mayor Saunderson, to Director Valentine, and I please forgive any ignorance that I display on this matter, as I don't sit on the Development and Operations Committee and leave those experts to their work. But I am curious to know. You said in an answer previous on the staff report that the Planning Act's timelines, deadlines have changed, and I'm seeing on this list 4 items that are being appealed for non-decision, and I wonder if you could just maybe walk me through, or walk us through, how it's possible that our planning department has not made decisions on some of these, or that the council hasn't made decisions on some of these, and just illuminate for me how this came to pass, because I feel as though, you know, it's one thing to get a D, it's another thing to not turn in your work. And maybe that's oversimplifying things, but it does seem odd to me that there's 4 out of 7 sitting here that are non-decisions. And I'm certain it's more complex than my understanding.
Director Valentine.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to Councillor McLeod. And I will speak in generalities here in order to sort of not get into the site specifics of each individual case. But as mentioned previously, one large driving factor towards appeals of non-decision, it was that shortening of Legislative Planning Act timeframes. For the example, zoning bylaw amendments were shortened from 120 days to 90 days to make a decision. So they were significantly made quite a bit shorter. But each appeal is unique, and there's other reasons why a decision may not be rendered. Oftentimes staff work with the applicants and peer reviewers to put what I would say is our best foot forward before bringing an application to council, wishing to have all the supporting documentation in line, as well as to ensure that we're able to support an application when it's brought forward. In addition, there can be additional public meetings. There can be significant changes to applications once we've undertaken the public process or once we've heard feedback from committee and council. So there are a variety of reasons why we have an increase of appeals of non-decision. It certainly is not a unique town of Collingwood situation. Municipalities across Ontario are struggling with this balance between expediting development applications for housing and economic development reasons and ensuring that the public interest is well protected through the review process. So it's quite a balancing act. I will say that one of the future forward considerations that was included in the report and something that we can all sort of consider and debate with the public as we move through this process is one option is planning staff could bring forward every application right before that Planning Act deadline, whether it's the best possible application or not, and council would be making a decision. In that case, we wouldn't be appealed for non-decision, but the alternate risk is we may be appealed for a decision where council was sort of forced into a situation where they had to make a decision where they didn't have all the information or all the documentation wasn't appropriately provided. So council, staff, municipalities are in a tough spot. But that was part of one of the purposes of the report is to provide a clearer process so that we can deal with these types of appeals and hopefully get through them a little bit more quickly.
Thank you, Director Valentine. Follow-up, Councillor?
No, thank you.
All right. Last call. Any questions or comments on this update before we move on? Seeing none, that brings us to item 8, which is other business. And I have 2 notices of motion under items 8.1. So I'm going to pass the chair to Councillor MacLeod.
Thank you. And we are on item 8.1 and we have some other business, and I will ask the mayor to read in his notices of motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And the first notice of motion is to revoke Mr. Ed Houghton's order of Collingwood. And it reads as follows. Whereas the Order of Collingwood was established in 1983 to recognize exemplary volunteer achievements by people who improve the social well-being, natural or cultural environment, or recreational character of the town of Collingwood. And whereas a recipient of the Order of Collingwood becomes a lifelong member of the Order of Collingwood and is entitled to all such privileges as may be bestowed upon members of the Order of Collingwood from time to time. And whereas council has the authority to rescind or revoke an award from a recipient at its discretion when a recipient's conduct deviates significantly from recognized standards and is seen as undermining the credibility, integrity, or relevance of the order. And whereas Mr. Ed Houghton was awarded the Order of Collingwood in 1998, and whereas Mr. Houghton was the CEO of Collis Power Corporation and acting CAO of the town of Collingwood when the town closed the sale of 50% of its interest in Collis Power Corporation to Powerstream Incorporated in 2012, and subsequently used the proceeds to purchase 2 sprung buildings for the town's recreational facilities through a sole source procurement. And whereas the Council of 2014-2018 asked the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Ontario to strike a judicial inquiry into these 2 transactions in 2018, and the then Associate Chief Justice Frank Morocco was appointed the Commissioner of the Collingwood Judicial Inquiry. And whereas Justice Morocco released his report on November 2nd, 2020, in which he found that, quotation, undisclosed conflicts, unfair procurements, and lack of transparency stained both transactions, end quotation. And whereas Justice Morocco found that Mr. Houghton, quotation, enjoyed unusual influence and freedom in his roles with the town and Collis Corporation, end quotation, and that Mr. Houghton was a central figure in both transactions. And whereas Mr. Justice Morocco did not accept Mr. Houghton's evidence on critical aspects of the inquiry, including the preparation of the staff report on the sprung buildings and contract. Specifically, Justice Morocco found that, quotation, the staff report recommended a sole source procurement based on misrepresentations, misstatements, mischaracterizations, omissions, and other inaccuracies, end quotation. And whereas Mr. Justice Morocco found that when quotation, the answers to legitimate questions are dismissive, spun, or obfuscated, public trust further erodes, end quotation. And that quotation, the relationship between the public and its municipal government may never be the same, end quotation. And whereas Mr. Houghton's actions during these two transactions, as found by Justice Morocco in his report, undermine the credibility and integrity of the Order of Collingwood and had a profound, devastating, and lasting impact on our community. Now, therefore, be it resolved that Council revoke Mr. Houghton's Order of Collingwood effective immediately.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I believe you have a second one.
I do, and I'll read that in now. Thank you. And this notice is to terminate our Collingwood's membership in the Ontario Municipal Water Association. It reads as follows. Whereas Collingwood is a member of the Ontario Municipal Water Association, OMWA, and whereas the OMWA website lists Mr. Ed Houghton as the Executive Director of OMWA, and whereas Mr. Houghton was the CEO of Collis Power Corporation and the acting CAO for the town of Collingwood when the town closed the sale of 50% of its interest in Collis Power Corporation to Powerstream Incorporated in 2012, and subsequently used the proceeds to purchase two sprung buildings for the town's recreational facilities through a sole source procurement. And whereas the town of Collingwood Council of 2014 to 2018 asked the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Ontario to strike a judicial inquiry into these two transactions in 2018, and the then Associate Chief Justice Frank Morocco was appointed the Commissioner of the Collingwood Judicial Inquiry. And whereas Justice Morocco released his report on November 2nd, 2020, in which he found that quotation, undisclosed conflicts, unfair procurements, and lack of transparency stain both transactions, end quotation. And whereas Mr. Justice Morocco found that when quotation, the answers to legitimate questions are dismissive, spun, or obfuscated, public trust further erodes, end quotation, and that quotation, the relationship between the public and its municipal government may never be the same, end quotation. And whereas Justice Morocco found that Mr. Houghton, quotation, enjoyed unusual influence and freedom in his roles with the town and Collis corporations, end quotation, and that Mr. Houghton was a central figure in both transactions. And whereas Mr. Houghton's actions during these two transactions, as found by Justice Morocco in his report, undermined the credibility and integrity of the town of Collingwood and had a profound, devastating, and lasting impact on our community. Now, therefore, be it resolved that Council terminate the town's membership in OMWA effective immediately, and further that a letter be sent to the OMWA board and copied to all members of OMWA attaching this motion and the link to Justice Morocco's report, transparency, and the public trust report of the Collingwood Judicial Inquiry.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. And those two notices of motion will be contemplated at our next council meeting, which will be on I am looking to Clerk almost for that date. I don't have it in front of me.
Thank you, Councillor McLeod. It is January the 24th.
Thank you very much. And with that other business concluded, I'll return the chair to Mayor Saunderson.
Thank you, Councillor McLeod. Councillor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. This morning I sent my questions ahead to Director Slama and the CAO Skinner because I wanted to ask about an event that happened over the holidays, and I just wanted to ask for an update. I probably could have done it under departmental updates, but I missed. But we had what was described as a catastrophic event at the wastewater treatment plant over the holidays, which required some very dedicated employees at what's supposed to be a festive time of year to help out with the alarm that went off at the wastewater treatment plant. And I'm just wondering if the director could just give us an update regarding the cleanup, the estimated costs of repairs, and or a timing of a report that would come to council re any proposed budget requirements. And additionally, I just would like to I have a question with respect to timing of notice to members of council when this type of an event occurs. I think in this case, we found out once everything had been handled and looked after, but really didn't have an understanding of what duress staff were under at the time and what our assets were under. And I think it's important to understand that. And also relaying the understanding of the potential for the type of event pending conditions that were maybe known to staff, but not to us, or maybe I wasn't paying attention enough to know that this should have been provided for sooner. So, but I did send them ahead, and Director Slama said she would be prepared to answer this evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Director Slama.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Jeffrey and the rest of Council, I just thought that I would give a brief summary of the event that did occur. The wastewater treatment plant was an operational event that started on December the 24th, Christmas Eve. So as Councillor Jeffrey mentioned, there was some alarms that triggered the on-call operator to attend site. They had to do with some issues with the sludge digestion process. And so the operator, upon assessing the situation, of course, notified the supervisor, made a determination to call in a septic hauler to get some assistance in vacuuming and cleaning out some lines, and did have to call in an additional operator to assist. While the operators were trying to address what they thought was the initial issue, we had an overpressurization of digester number 2. And when that occurred, what happened is some partially digested sludge seeped between the wall and the roof of that digester, and was obviously then starting to reach the ground on site. So a second septic hauler was then called to the plant. And while one was trying to clean the pipes, another one was cleaning up the sludge that was spilling on within the site. And yes, as Councillor Jeffrey noted, so this happened on the 24th, and both these operators and these septic haulers, we're very thankful that they responded to the calls for assistance, and it definitely required them to, give up their personal time on a holiday to address this, because they did work all night to really minimize the situation and try to contain it as best they could. So when the spill started, once the situation was under control operationally, the on-call operator notified Spills Action, as is our requirement, and then Spills Action notifies the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. And so the operator and the operational team was kept in touch with Spills Action during this time. Both Spills Action and MECP understood the situation. They understood what the operational team was doing, and they agreed with those actions. In the end, it's estimated approximately 100 cubic meters of digested sludge or partially digested sludge did escape the digester, and this was mostly contained on site. Some of it was approaching the south end of the site, the south side of the site, which is close to the trail that runs behind Shoppers Drug Mart. So again, operation team reached out to Public Works and Parks and got that section of the trail closed as a proactive measure. Also, some of the more solids was approaching the creek and reached the creek on the east side, the drainage ditch on the east side of our site. And that was able to be contained until it could be cleaned up by the sludge haulers. And again, that was part of the reporting that was done to Spills Action. And they were aware of the amounts and the locations and the cleanup actions that were undertaken by staff and contractors. So to address or to speak to Councillor Jeffrey's comments about it may be forecasting this and or making sure that as a as a council and staff, we're supporting the work that needs to be done. We've done some work on digester number 1 at the wastewater treatment plant in 2021. So we had actually planned to do some of the same work related to digester number 2 in 2022. So we had included in our operational budget, which was approved by council, $250,000, which was going to be for the clean out of the digester, inspection, any kind of minor repairs that might need to be done, and any other preventative work that would be done on this kind of rotational basis. And typically we would do this kind of maintenance to the digesters about once every 5 years. And so this event has really kind of fast tracked that work for digester number 2. So the good news is that, we have a budget set aside, approved and allocated for some of this, but because of the overpressurization of the digester tank, we're going to have to start with something that wasn't accounted for, which is have an engineer come on site and do a structural review and verify the structural integrity of the digester. So it's possible we might find that we have more than minor repairs as we deal with this digester number 2. So our intention is, we haven't received any invoices from our contractors. So I'm unable to tell you today kind of what we spent to date on this emergency response to this event. But we could provide that information in the future once we have it. But the intention would be to use the budget that's been allocated for this under our operational budget. And if we find following the structural inspection that there is more work that needs to be added to this 2022 project, then we will need to come back to council and look for an increase in the budget for that project. One more thing I wanted to mention is, we did as an organizational team did a root cause analysis and talked about, how this happened and ways it could be mitigated. The operators have some good ideas that maybe there's some other changes that might be beneficial to the piping at the plant that might help really minimize the potential of this happening again. Again, that would be something that we hadn't planned and budgeted for. So it would be part of any future report to council if we felt that was the best way to really minimize our risk in the future of this occurring again, and if we needed more additional funds to support that work. So I think, and then we've also noted the team noted they could do some additional preventative maintenance within that 5-year time frame, like, maybe annually doing a big part of the issue was some clogged pipes, and that those have just been clogged over time. So we talked about maybe annually we put in the operating budget cameraing some of the pipes and making sure that we're not seeing buildup or potential clogging. So that's something else that we're considering. So I think that was mostly what I wanted to summarize for council, and we can, if there's any questions or anything else from council members.
Thank you, Director Slama. Councillor Jeffrey, any follow-up?
Just to say thank you very much for having a thorough response ready to update council tonight. Really appreciate that and the efforts of everyone. And maybe the only thing outstanding for me through to the CAO would be a different timing for letting council know that something like that event is ongoing. Number one, in case we get questions. In this case, we didn't get any complaints of odor or whatever. So, nobody got any questions, but I think as a council member, I'd like to know a lot sooner in the process that you were dealing with it. And so that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. CAO Skinner, go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Jeffrey. Point taken. It wasn't a busy time of year, and we could have let council know earlier. And then this is just a joke. People with hip waders could have come out. No, just kidding. We'd never ask council to do that. We have some specialists, but point well taken. We will endeavor to do so more quickly in the future. And I did also want to draw one link to another item that was mentioned in our budget presentations and a link to our strategic plan. There was some discussion about a more robust risk management and enterprise risk management framework. And we now in the clerk's office have our accountability and risk manager on board. So it is our intention to do some more work looking at risks that can be brought to staff and council's attention. I know there was a few over the past year that were concerning to me, and I'm sure to council, things like and availability of water and potentially this item as well. And not that we could ever predict everything, but it's as we move forward together, I think the continuous improvement will include a robust kicking of the tires on every service to make sure that we've looked at some of the risks that council and senior staff need to be aware of and proactively managing. So thank you for that.
Thank you, CAO. Councillor, any other questions or comments on this particular item? Oh, CAO, go ahead, and then I'm going to go to Councillor Doherty.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Chair. I did also want to mention thanks to Director Slama. She was also involved in the cleanup over the Christmas period and to making sure that everything was happening as it should. So thank you to you, Director Slama, Manager McGinnity, the operators that came on site, and of course the two contractors. Thank you for that additional chance to comment as well, Chair.
Yes. Yes, and well deserved. It was an unfortunate situation. There's lots of words that come to mind, and most of them we can't use right now. So, and with that, I'll go to Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you to Director Slama and or CAO Skinner. I noted that among the items that were found in the clogs that caused this event was rags. And it seems to me that our residents could play a role also in assuring that this kind of event doesn't happen again. And that is to be very cognizant of what they flush down the toilet, and also to be cognizant of the fact that so-called flushable wipes are not flushable, or certainly not easily flushable, and certainly not well digestible in our wastewater system. So I hope that among our future communications with residents that we might remind them of that.
Thank you, Councillor. I see heads nodding. I don't know if anyone wants to comment from staff on that. Go ahead, Director Slama, and then I've got some CAO Skinner as well.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. Absolutely. You know, those I think we can always probably do a better job of communicating to the public what should not be flushed down the toilet. And we did some communication on that. Maybe it wasn't in 21, maybe it was in 2020, but an opportunity to look at revamping that communication or initiating it again.
Thank you. CAO Skinner.
Thank you, Your Worship. I would just add, and through you to Councillor Doherty and potentially all of council, it was a councillor's notice of motion that prompted us to do that communication and to put together some robust materials that we now have ready to use. So that's a good heads up move by a council member a year or so ago as well in recognizing this risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, any other questions or comments on this item? Seeing none, any other business for tonight's meeting? Councillor Hanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I did give notice to Executive Director Peg that I wanted to ask this question tonight. So through you, Mr. Mayor, our Affordable Housing Task Force had recommended a housing specialist be hired to help advance housing in our community. And of course, in our 2022 budget, we did include that provision. So I'm just wondering if council could have an update on the status of the hiring for that position at this time, because we have an absolute need for housing now. Yeah.
Okay, I see we've got Director Valentine and Executive Director Peg, so I'm going to leave it to you two to tag team on this one.
Thank you, Your Worship. I was actually going to suggest Director Valentine, so that's wonderful that she's already turned her camera on, so thank you.
Go ahead, Director.
Through you, Your Worship, to the councillor. And I think I've been tagged with providing the response, but it's certainly not just a planning matter, but a corporate matter that's under discussion. So after the approval of the budget late last year, staff have started to regroup in determining what the best format is for that resource in order to achieve council and the Attainable Housing Task Force's objectives in the overall housing portfolio in terms of the number of recommendations that were met. Or that were advanced. So council will recall that through the budget deliberations, there was quite a bit of discussion over whether that resource should be a consultant or a contract person or a staff individual, and maybe a combination of those within the budget that was allocated in order to move forward the housing portfolio as quickly as possible. So staff are keenly aware of council's desire to move quickly on this initiative, and will continue down the recruitment path with a more definitive update for you in the next cycle as part of a larger overall update and report back on the task force recommendations. So that's what I can offer at this point, with the assurance that further information is coming and staff are working on the recruitment at this time.
Thank you, Director. Any follow-up, Councillor Hamlin?
Yes, just one follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for that update. I'm just wondering the response on all the recommendations, perhaps will take longer than the need for an update on the hiring. So if there was some update on the hiring, could you possibly bring that back to council? There's certainly a lot of members of our community who are following this as well. So I think that would be helpful. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Is there any other business, council? Seeing none, I'm going to look to Clerk Almus then. Item 9 is public delegations. And I don't know if any member of the public wants to speak to council on an item for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will open it up again to any of our attendees participating in this afternoon's meeting. If you wish to address the standing committee, please press the raise your hand feature. If you are on a telephone, please press *9. Your Worship, I'm just going to wait a brief moment because I did receive some feedback that sometimes we bypass this a little quickly and people don't have a chance to toggle their raise your hand feature. And at this time, we have no members of our public wishing to address the standing committee.
All right, well, that brings us to adjournment then. I'm just going to remind council that we have a separate login for our special meeting. And it's now 6:36. So I'm going to suggest that we do a very short turnaround and try to be back on for the special meeting at 6:40 so that we can conclude. Go ahead, CAO Skinner.
I'm assuming that you may have been just about to mention this, but I think the out of the cold number you were going to mention a second time, or potentially you meant that at the next meeting, but I didn't want to inadvertently leave anyone in the cold this evening.
No, thank you for that. I was going to mention it as well at the special meeting, but I will say it again before I called for the adjournment. And if people want, with the weather out, they're predicting temperatures as low as -35 tonight with the wind chill and heavy snow. So please, if you are in need, the Out of the Cold program is operational. or if you know someone who needs assistance, you can go to the website Out of the Cold Collingwood, all one word, .com/. You can also phone 705-828-3477. And you can connect as well on social media through Get Connected at busbycenter.ca, and Busby is BUSBY, Center CENTRE.ca. So please, if you know anyone who needs assistance, those are the contact numbers. And with that, I will look for the motion to adjourn. Thank you, Councillor Jeffrey. All in favor? And that we are adjourned. So if we can quickly turn around and get on to the special meeting, then we can get people home tonight. Thank you, and I'll see you all shortly.